I'm Jamal, 34 years old, and until last month, I believed the trust fund my grandparents set up for me had vanished into my parents' and brother's pockets. For 3 years, I watched them live lavishly with my money while feeding me lies about failed investments. Then my phone rang. It was the bank manager. His voice urgent. "There's something about your trust fund. You need to know immediately." My parents assumed they'd covered their tracks, but there was fine print they never bothered to read. If you're watching this, drop a comment where you're from and subscribe for what happened next when they realized their mistake. My relationship with my grandparents was always special. Grandpa Charles and Grandma Eleanor weren't just wealthy, they were wise. They built their fortune from nothing, starting with a small electronics repair shop in the 1960 seconds that eventually grew into a regional chain of stores. Unlike my parents, my grandparents understood the value of every dollar because they earned each one through sweat and determination. Money that comes too easy leaves just as easy. Grandpa would tell me during our weekend fishing trips. He'd point at the horizon where the sun was setting over the lake. "Build your wealth like the day builds light, Jamal. Slowly, steadily, and with purpose." I cherished those moments. While most kids were playing video games, I was learning about compound interest and investment strategies from a man who grew up during the Great Depression. Grandma was equally influential, teaching me about budgeting and the difference between wants and needs. They weren't just teaching me about money, they were teaching me about life. My parents, unfortunately, were cut from a different cloth. Dad inherited his father's business acumen, but none of his discipline. Mom had expensive taste that always seemed to exceed their considerable income. Despite having access to family wealth and opportunities, they lived paycheck to paycheck, always chasing the next status symbol or luxury vacation. Their financial struggles weren't from lack of resources, but from poor decisions and impulsive spending. Then there was my younger brother, Aaron. From the moment he was born, he seemed to hold some mysterious power over our parents. While I was held to strict standards and expected to earn privileges, Aaron simply had to ask. When I needed a new computer for school, I had to present a detailed argument about educational benefits. When Aaron wanted the latest gaming system, it appeared the next day without question. I remember when I was 16 and Aaron was 12. I'd saved for months to buy a used bike for deliveries so I could earn money. The same week I bought my second-hand bike. My parents surprised Aaron with a brand new one, despite him having shown no interest in cycling before. "Your brother looks up to you," Mom explained when she saw my confusion. "We want to encourage him to be industrious like you." By the time I was finishing high school, the pattern was clear. I was expected to be the responsible one who needed minimal support, while Aaron was fragile and required constant bolstering. I didn't resent him for it. He was just playing the game our parents had created. Sometimes, I even felt sorry for him, knowing he wasn't developing the skills he'd need in the real world. The summer before I left for college, Grandpa and Grandma invited me to their lake house for a weekend alone. Over homemade apple pie, they explained their plans for my future. "We've set up trust funds for both you and Aaron," Grandpa explained, his voice more serious than usual. "The money is for education, buying your first home, or starting a business. Nothing else." Grandma reached for my hand. "We've seen how your parents handle money, Jamal. We love them, but we want to make sure you boys have security they can't interfere with." The terms were clear. I could access small amounts for educational expenses immediately, but the bulk would become available when I turned 30, with provisions for home purchases or business ventures, before that with bank approval. Aaron had identical terms. I didn't think much about the trust after that conversation. College was my focus, and I'd been accepted to a good state university on a partial scholarship. I worked part-time throughout my 4 years, determined to graduate with minimal debt despite having trust fund money available. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply the values my grandparents had instilled in me. During my sophomore year, both grandparents' health began declining. Grandpa developed heart problems, and Grandma was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. I visited as often as I could, sometimes just sitting with Grandma as she repeated the same stories or helping Grandpa with simple tasks that had become difficult for him. During one of my last visits, Grandpa pulled me aside while Grandma was napping. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice weaker than I remembered. "You understand what matters. The trust fund is just a tool, not a solution. Use it wisely." 3 months later, they were both gone, passing within weeks of each other. At the reading of the will, the trust arrangements were confirmed exactly as they had explained. My parents' faces were a study in contained disappointment when the lawyer explained that they would not be trustees or have access to the funds. "The bank will administer both trusts," the lawyer explained, with strict guidelines about permitted withdrawals. I caught the look my parents exchanged, a mixture of frustration and calculation that made me uneasy. But I was grieving and about to start my final year of college, so I filed away that observation and focused on honoring my grandparents by finishing strong academically. Aaron, meanwhile, barely maintained the grades needed to graduate high school. While I was interviewing for jobs in my field, he was taking a gap year that looked suspiciously like playing video games in our parents' basement. I moved to Seattle for a software development position, while he half-heartedly enrolled in community college, only to drop out after 1 semester. I settled into my career, lived within my means, and occasionally requested trust fund distributions for graduate courses that enhanced my professional skills. Every request was documented meticulously with receipts and course descriptions. Aaron, from what I could tell, had yet to access his trust fund for anything productive. During a holiday visit home, 3 years after graduation, I overheard a conversation that should have been my first real warning. "Aaron deserves extra help," Dad was saying in a hushed voice to Mom. "Jamal's always been able to make his own way." "The trustees are strict," Mom replied, "but I think I've found a workaround." I should have asked questions then. Maybe everything would have turned out differently if I had. By the time I turned 27, my career in software development was thriving. I had moved up to a senior developer position at a growing tech company, had a modest but comfortable apartment in Seattle, and was carefully saving for eventual homeownership. I checked my trust fund statements quarterly, satisfied to see it growing steadily under the conservative investment strategy my grandparents had established. Aaron's path was considerably less stable. He had attempted 3 different college programs in 5 years, never making it past the 2nd semester of any of them. There was always an excuse. The professors were unfair, the material wasn't engaging, or most commonly, he just wasn't passionate about it. Each time, our parents would nod sympathetically and assure him that finding your path takes time. During family video calls, I'd notice how quickly my parents would change the subject whenever I mentioned a promotion or project success. Conversely, Aaron's smallest achievements, like simply attending classes for a full month, were celebrated as if he'd won a Nobel Prize. "Your brother's finding his way," Mom would say whenever I expressed concern. "We can't all be naturally disciplined like you, Jamal." The first concrete sign that something was wrong came in the form of a quarterly trust fund statement that showed an unusual withdrawal of $5,000. The category was listed vaguely as educational expense, but I hadn't requested any funds for my ongoing professional certification courses, preferring to pay out of pocket and save the trust for larger future investments. I called the bank immediately, and after navigating a frustrating phone tree, finally reached someone who checked the records. It appears there were some administrative fees and expenses related to your educational pursuits, Mr. Wilson, the representative said in a rehearsed tone. Everything seems to be in order. According to our records, something felt off, but I had a major project deadline approaching and decided to follow up more thoroughly when I had time. 2 weeks later, Aaron posted photos on social media of himself driving a brand new Audi A5. The caption read, "New wheels for the new semester. Number blessed. Number new beginnings." Aaron had never held a job that paid more than minimum wage, and even those rarely lasted more than a few months. There was no way he could afford a $50,000 car. I called him directly, bypassing our parents for once. "Nice car," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "That's quite an investment." "Yeah, Mom and Dad helped me out," he replied casually. "Said I needed reliable transportation for school. Plus, image is important for networking." The school he referred to was another community college program he'd just enrolled in, this time for business administration. The campus was less than 2 miles from our parents' home where he still lived. Something wasn't adding up. During my next visit home 3 months later, I noticed significant changes to my parents' house. The kitchen had been completely renovated with high-end appliances and custom cabinetry. The living room featured new furniture that I recognized from a luxury brand. And Dad was sporting a watch that I knew cost at least $10,000. Over dinner, I carefully brought up the topic of finances. "Business must be going well," I observed, nodding toward Dad's watch. "The house looks amazing too." An uncomfortable glance passed between my parents before Dad cleared his throat. "We've made some good investments," he said vaguely, "and decided it was time to enjoy the fruits of our labor a bit." Mom quickly changed the subject to Aaron's new photography hobby, which apparently required several $1,000s worth of professional equipment despite him having shown no prior interest in the field. When I tried to return to the topic of their sudden wealth later that evening, Dad became uncharacteristically defensive. "Not everything needs to be analyzed to death, Jamal," he snapped. "Some of us prefer to enjoy life rather than overthinking every dollar and cent." The next day, I decided to request complete records of my trust fund activity from the bank. The customer service representative sounded uncomfortable when I made my request. "We'll need to have the trust department prepare those records," she said. "It might take a few weeks." "A few weeks to print account statements?" I asked, suspicion growing. "There are protocols we need to follow," she replied evasively. While waiting for the records, I received a promotion at work that came with a substantial raise. With my improved financial position, I began seriously looking at condos in Seattle, planning to use some of my trust fund for the down payment as my grandparents had intended. I mentioned this plan to my parents during our weekly call, explaining that I'd be requesting about $60,000 from my trust. "Are you sure that's the best use of your money right now?" Mom asked, her voice carrying an edge of panic that seemed disproportionate. "Property in Seattle is so overpriced." Dad jumped in before I could respond. "Family resources should be shared, Jamal. Your brother is still finding his footing, and drawing on the trust now might limit options for all of us later." "All of us?" I repeated, confused. "The trusts are separate. My decisions don't affect Aaron's fund." Another uncomfortable silence followed before Mom murmured something about a timer going off in the kitchen and hurriedly ended the call. 2 days later, Aaron posted photos of himself on a beach in Bali, cocktail in hand, with a caption about much-needed me time and recharging before the next big chapter. He dropped out of his business program 3 weeks earlier. Growing increasingly concerned, I made an unplanned visit to my local bank branch to speak with someone in person about my trust. The teller, A young woman who was new and clearly not fully trained on protocols made a comment that sent ice through my veins. "Oh yes, the Wilson Trust. There have been quite regular withdrawals lately. Let me get the manager for you." Before she could say more, a senior staff member appeared at her side, whispered something to her, and then turned to me with a professional smile. "Mr. Wilson, please come to my office. I understand you have questions about your account." The manager, Mr. Peterson, was polite but evasive, repeating only that all transactions were within the guidelines of the trust and that detailed records would be sent to me soon. He refused to provide any specific information about recent withdrawals. As I left the bank, my phone pinged with a text from Aaron showing off a new collection of designer clothes. "Interview ready." The caption read. Though I knew of no actual job interviews on his schedule, the anxiety that had been building over months crystallized into a cold certainty. Someone was systematically draining my trust fund, and my family was involved. The question was no longer if it was happening, but how extensive the damage was, and what, if anything, I could do about it. My 30th birthday should have been a milestone celebration. According to the terms of my grandparents' trust, this was when I would gain full access to the fund, a financial foundation they had established to help launch the next phase of my life. Instead of excitement, I felt a growing dread. As the dinner my parents had insisted on hosting approached, they'd chosen an upscale restaurant in my hometown, where I'd returned specifically for this occasion. Aaron arrived 20 minutes late, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My parents seemed unusually tense, Dad repeatedly checking his watch while Mom reapplied her lipstick twice before we'd even ordered appetizers. "So," I said after we'd received our drinks, "I spoke with the bank yesterday. Today's the day I get full access to the trust." The glance my parents exchanged was quick, but loaded with meaning. Aaron suddenly became intensely interested in the breadbasket. "Actually, son," Dad began in a tone I recognized from childhood discussions about disappointing grades or broken rules, "there's something we need to discuss about the trust." He launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about unfortunate market conditions and necessary family financial realignments. The words washed over me as I watched his body language, the way his hands fidgeted with his napkin, the lack of eye contact. "What my father is trying to say," Mom interjected, tears already welling in her eyes, "is that we've had to make some difficult decisions as a family, decisions that affected the trust funds." "Both trust funds?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Well, no," Dad admitted after a pause. Aaron's education and career development needs were substantial, and as parents, we had to prioritize. I sat in stunned silence as they continued their explanation. According to my parents, they had used a series of entirely legal financial maneuvers to redirect funds from my trust to Aaron's, and then used his trust, with its more flexible interpretation of educational expenses, to support what they called the family's overall financial well-being. "How much is left?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed told me everything before Dad finally answered. "About 10% of the original amount." The restaurant continued its normal evening service around us, servers describing specials and wine pairings, other diners laughing and clinking glasses. But at our table, time seemed suspended as I processed the magnitude of what they'd just admitted. "You stole 90% of my trust fund," I said flatly. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "That's a harsh and inaccurate characterization," Dad replied, his voice taking on the defensive tone I'd heard increasingly over the past few years. "We reallocated family resources to where they were most needed." Aaron finally looked up from his menu. "Don't be so dramatic, Jamal. It's not like you needed the money anyway. You've always been the golden boy, with the perfect job and perfect life. You bought a sports car with my money, I said, struggling to keep my voice level, and designer clothes, and international vacations. How exactly were those needed? Your brother required confidence-building experiences, Mom said earnestly. The right car, the right clothes, the right experiences, all contribute to professional success in today's world. While I worked 60-hour weeks and lived in a one-bedroom apartment to save money, I replied. Dad straightened his shoulders, shifting into the authoritative posture he'd used throughout my childhood. What's done is done. Jamal, our attorney, assured us that the way we structured the transactions was technically within the legal parameters of the trust. The trustees were perhaps not as diligent as they should have been, but that's hardly our concern. The realization that this betrayal wasn't a recent decision, but a systematic 3-year campaign left me breathless. While I'd been working hard and planning carefully for my future, my own family had been methodically dismantling the foundation my grandparents had built for me. I was going to buy a home, I said quietly. I had plans to start my own development firm next year. And you still can, Mom said brightly, reaching across the table to pat my hand. I pulled away before she could touch me, just perhaps on a slightly longer timeline. You're so resourceful, Jamal. Aaron rolled his eyes. See? This is exactly why they did it. You always land on your feet anyway. I'm the one who needed the boost. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. He was 32 years old, had never completed a semester of college despite multiple attempts, had never held a job for more than a few months, and had no discernible skills or direction. And now, he sat across from me in a $500 shirt, reeking of entitlement and completely unembarrassed about benefiting from theft. You have no idea what you've done, I said, standing up. To me. To yourselves. To what Grandma and Grandpa wanted for both of us. Don't be melodramatic, Dad said sharply. Family finances are fluid. And as the heads of this family, your mother and I made decisions we felt were best. Best for who? I asked, throwing my napkin on the table. Best for Aaron? For yourselves? Because it certainly wasn't best for me, and it definitely wasn't what my grandparents intended when they established these trusts. Jamal, please, Mom pleaded. It's your birthday. Let's not end the evening like this. My birthday, I repeated. The day I was supposed to access the trust fund you've emptied. You're right. Let's not end the evening like this. Let's not have an evening at all. I walked out of the restaurant, ignoring their calls behind me. The night air was cool against my flushed face as I got into my car, a practical 5-year-old sedan that I'd planned to replace once I accessed my trust fund. The drive back to my hotel was a blur of streetlights and conflicting emotions. Once in my room, I pulled out the trust documents I'd brought with me, hoping to find something, anything, that might provide recourse. I called 3 different attorneys that night, all of whom offered sympathetic noises but little hope after hearing the broad outlines of the situation. If they had legal counsel helping them structure these transactions, and if the trustees approved the withdrawals, you may have limited options, one attorney told me. You could sue, but family financial cases are messy, expensive, and often ultimately unsatisfying. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake cataloging every memory of my parents' favoritism, every dismissal of my achievements, every time they'd positioned Aaron's needs as more important than mine. The pattern was clear now, but the scale of their betrayal was still incomprehensible. By morning, I had decided to cut contact with my family indefinitely. I wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't sure I ever would be, and couldn't bear the thought of watching them continue to enjoy the fruits of their theft. I checked out of the hotel early and drove straight to the airport, changing my flight to return to Seattle immediately. Happy birthday to me, I whispered to myself as the plane took off, leaving behind not just my hometown, but the last shreds of trust I had in the people who were supposed to love me most. The weeks following my birthday dinner were some of the darkest of my life. Back in Seattle, I went through the motions of my daily routine like a sleepwalker, present physically, but emotionally numb. My work suffered as I struggled to focus on coding problems that had once engaged me completely. My team leader noticed, gently suggesting I take some personal time, but I refused. Work was the only area of my life that still made sense. Sleep became elusive, my nights spent either staring at the ceiling or falling into exhausted, nightmare-filled dozes where I repeatedly discovered new betrayals. I lost weight without trying, food tasting like ash in my mouth. Friends invited me out, concerned by my withdrawal. But I declined more often than not, unable to explain what had happened without emotion overwhelming me. 3 days after returning to Seattle, I started therapy with Dr. Marquez, a calm, steady presence who created space for my anger and grief without judgment. What you're experiencing is a form of trauma, she explained during our second session. Betrayal by those we trust implicitly affects our sense of safety in the world. Your reaction is entirely appropriate to the magnitude of what's happened. In that sterile office with its muted colors and comfortable chairs, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of my family's betrayal. The tears that came were not gentle. They were wrenching, painful expressions of rage and loss that left me exhausted. They didn't just take money, I told Dr. Marquez. They took security, options, dreams, the future my grandparents wanted for me, and they took your trust, she added quietly. Perhaps that's the most valuable thing of all. My phone filled with voicemails and texts from my parents, each message carefully crafted to minimize their actions, while maximizing my responsibility to move forward as a family. We should discuss this in person, Dad's most recent voicemail began. There are aspects of the situation you don't fully understand. I deleted it without responding, just as I had the previous 12 messages. Aaron's approach was different. Rather than contacting me directly, he continued posting on social media, each image a fresh reminder of what had been taken from me. A new watch, golf clubs, a weekend trip to wine country. Once, he tagged me in a photo from a luxury resort spa with the caption, "Wish you were here, bro." I blocked him immediately. The betrayal colonized my thoughts during waking hours and invaded my dreams at night. I questioned every memory of my family, wondering if there had ever been genuine love, or if I'd simply been a resource to be used. The questions extended beyond my immediate family to relationships in general. If the people who raised me could justify this level of betrayal, who could I ever trust? During our fourth session, Dr. Marquez suggested an exercise. "I'd like you to write letters you'll never send," she explained. One to your parents, one to Aaron, one to your grandparents, and one to yourself. Express everything you feel without filter or concern about how it might be received. The letters became a lifeline. I wrote to my parents about their decades of favoritism, culminating in this ultimate betrayal. To Aaron about his entitlement and willingness to benefit from theft. To my grandparents about my gratitude for their love and my sorrow that their wishes had been so flagrantly disregarded. And finally, to myself, acknowledging the shock, grief, and fear I was experiencing. 2 weeks into this isolation, Marcus, my closest friend since college, physically showed up at my apartment with takeout and refused to leave until I talked to him. After hearing the full story, his outrage on my behalf was both validating and oddly comforting. "That's theft, plain and simple," he said, pacing my small living room. "And the fact that they don't even seem to recognize it as wrong is mind-blowing." His presence that evening created a tiny crack in the wall I'd built around myself. The following weekend, I accepted an invitation to dinner with a small group of friends, forcing myself to engage despite the hollowness I still felt. Their normalcy, their uncomplicated enjoyment of food and conversation, reminded me that the world continued turning despite my personal earthquake. 5 weeks after the birthday dinner, I met with a financial advisor to assess my situation and develop a new plan. The reality was stark. Without the trust fund, my timeline for homeownership stretched from next year to potentially 5 years away. The business I'd planned to launch would require outside investors rather than being self-funded. Retirement would come later than I'd anticipated. "It's not hopeless," the advisor assured me, reviewing my salary and current savings. "You're still in a better position than many. But yes, the loss of the trust fund is a significant setback." The clinical way she referred to the theft as a loss made me laugh bitterly for the first time in weeks. My parents, growing desperate at my continued silence, escalated their tactics. My aunt called, then my uncle, each relaying messages from my parents about how worried they were, how the misunderstanding needed to be resolved. "It's not a misunderstanding when they've admitted what they did," I told my aunt flatly. Before ending the call, the stress manifested physically. Insomnia became my constant companion. I developed tension headaches that medication barely touched. My stomach rebelled against food, and I caught every cold that circulated through the office. The breaking point came during a family reunion I hadn't planned to attend, but was ambushed into when several relatives stopped in Seattle specifically to see me. Gathered in a hotel lobby, I maintained a mask of normalcy as they chatted about inconsequential matters, no one acknowledging the absence of my parents and brother or the reason behind it. "Your mom says you're not returning her calls," my cousin Jennifer finally said, attempting casual but achieving awkward. "She's really broken up about it." "I'm sure she is," I replied neutrally, offering no further explanation. "Families have disagreements," my Uncle Dave chimed in. "But at the end of the day, they're still family." I looked at these people who shared my blood, but not my experience, who wanted harmony without justice, reconciliation without accountability. "Sometimes family are the people who hurt you the most," I said quietly, "because they know exactly where to place the knife." The gathering dispersed soon after, discomfort hanging heavy in the air. I returned to my apartment, and for the first time since learning of the betrayal, felt a strange sense of peace. I had spoken my truth without apology. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the crushing weight began to lift, not through forgiveness, which I wasn't ready to consider, but through a growing understanding that while my family had taken my inheritance, they couldn't take my identity or my future unless I allowed it. I recommitted to my work, finding flow in coding challenges again. I began joining my recreational basketball league for games instead of making excuses. I met Laura, a UX designer at a partner company, and found myself genuinely laughing at her wry observations about tech culture. The pain didn't disappear, but it became more manageable, a scar rather than an open wound. In therapy, I began exploring not just the recent betrayal but the family dynamics that had made it possible. "Your parents created a system where Aaron's needs always trumped yours," Dr. Marquez observed. "That didn't start with the trust fund. This perspective helped me see that my parents' behavior, while inexcusable, was the culmination of patterns established long ago rather than a sudden decision to betray me. It didn't lessen the wrong, but it made it comprehensible. And then, 67 days after my birthday dinner, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The caller identified himself as Mr. Daniels from Fidelity Trust Bank, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately set my heart racing. "Mr. Wilson, there's something about your trust fund that you need to know immediately. Can you come to our main branch tomorrow morning? This isn't a matter I can discuss over the phone." The calm I'd worked so hard to achieve shattered instantly, replaced by a nauseating mixture of hope and dread. What more could there possibly be to discover about my emptied trust? And why did this banker sound almost pleased? "I'll be there," I said, already knowing I wouldn't sleep that night. The Fidelity Trust Bank's downtown Seattle branch exuded old-world stability with its marble columns and polished wood. I arrived 15 minutes early for my appointment with Mr. St. Daniels, my stomach tight with anxiety. The receptionist escorted me not to a standard meeting room, but to an executive conference room where 3 people waited. Mr. Daniels, a severe-looking woman introduced as Miss Winters from the legal department, and a middle-aged man named Dr. Ramirez, who was identified as a forensic accountant. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, Mr. Wilson." Mr. Daniels began once I was seated. He was older than I expected, perhaps in his early 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses that hung from a chain around his neck. "I apologize for the mystery, but what we're about to discuss requires both discretion and direct communication." He placed a thick folder on the table between us. 3 weeks ago, our internal audit department flagged some unusual patterns of withdrawal from your trust fund. This triggered a deep review that uncovered irregularities. "I'm already aware that my parents systematically drained my trust fund," I said flatly. "If that's what you're referring to." The 3 exchanged glances before Mr. Daniels continued. "Yes and no, Mr. Wilson. We're aware of the withdrawals. But what you may not know is that your grandparents anticipated potential conflicts of interest." He opened the folder and removed a document, sliding it across to me. "This is a special addendum to your trust agreement that wasn't included in the standard documentation. Your grandfather insisted it be kept separate and only activated under specific circumstances." I scanned the document, legal terminology swimming before my eyes, until I reached a highlighted section that made my breath catch. "Monitoring protocols?" I read aloud. Dr. Ramirez leaned forward. "Your grandfather was, forgive me, suspicious of your parents' financial judgment. He established sophisticated monitoring systems for both trusts, including automatic flags for certain types of transactions and patterns of withdrawal. The unusual withdrawal activity triggered a secondary review system," Miss Winters continued. "One that your parents and the regular trustees were unaware existed." Mr. Daniels nodded. "Once those flags were raised, we began documenting every transaction in extreme detail, far beyond standard practices. Times, locations, authorization methods, stated purposes, everything." He passed me another document, this one filled with transaction records spanning 3 years. Each withdrawal was meticulously documented with dates, amounts, stated purposes, and actual uses where they could be determined. "Your parents claimed educational expenses for things that were clearly personal purchases," Dr. Ramirez explained, pointing to several entries. "They created false documentation, including enrollment records for programs that either didn't exist or that your brother never attended. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. False invoices, forged signatures, fabricated educational programs, Each transaction had been constructed with careful attention to superficially meet the trust requirements, while actually funding luxury purchases, home renovations, vacations, and Aaron's extravagant lifestyle. Your grandfather suspected something like this might happen, Mr. Daniels said quietly. He loved your parents, but he wasn't blind to their weaknesses or their pattern of favoring your brother. The realization that my grandfather had anticipated this betrayal decades ago hit me like a physical blow. Had he known my parents so much better than I had? Had the signs been there all along? The critical point, Mr. Wilson, Miss Winters interjected, is that these weren't legal loopholes as your parents claimed. The documentation we've gathered constitutes clear evidence of fraud. Fraud, I repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. Yes. Deliberate deception. For financial gain. Her expression was professionally neutral, but her tone carried unmistakable disapproval. The trustees were negligent in their oversight, but your parents and brother actively created false documentation and misrepresented the purpose of withdrawals. That crosses the line from unethical to illegal. Dr. Ramirez slid another document toward me. We've been able to trace most of the funds. Your brother was a willing participant, not just a beneficiary. He created false enrollment records, fabricated invoices, and in several cases, directly represented himself as authorized to make decisions about your trust. I flipped through pages of evidence showing Aaron's signature on documents requesting funds for non-existent educational programs, his email correspondence with trustees making false claims, even photographs of him at bank branches conducting transactions he had no authority to make. Why are you showing me all this now? I asked, looking up from the damning evidence. Why not 3 years ago, when it started? Mr. Daniels sighed. The monitoring system was designed to gather evidence, not immediately intervene. Your grandfather was very specific about that. The triggers for review were set, but the protocol was to document thoroughly until either you reported concerns or the pattern reached certain thresholds, which it did 2 months ago, Miss Winters added. The acceleration of withdrawals as your 30th birthday approached triggered our final review stage. We've already engaged a specialized legal team, Mr. Daniels continued. Fidelity Trust accepts significant responsibility for the failures of our regular trustees to identify these issues earlier. We're prepared to pursue recovery of the misappropriated funds on your behalf, at our expense. My mind was spinning. After weeks of believing I had no recourse, that my family had legally, if unethically, taken my inheritance, I was suddenly being offered not just hope, but concrete action. Recovery? I repeated. You think you can get the money back? Dr. Ramirez nodded confidently. In cases like this, when we can track the expenditures so precisely, recovery rates are typically quite high. Your parents and brother have purchased physical assets that can be liquidated, and we have documentation of exactly which funds went where. And if they resist? I asked. Miss Winters' expression hardened slightly. Then we move from civil recovery to criminal charges. Banking fraud carries significant penalties, including potential incarceration. The thought of my parents, or Aaron in prison, sent an unexpected wave of conflicted emotions through me. Despite everything, some part of me still recoiled from causing them that level of harm. There are options between full prosecution and doing nothing, Mr. Daniels said gently, seemingly reading my expression. Our primary goal is recovering your funds. How we get there can be negotiated. The next 2 hours were spent reviewing options, from demand letters to structured settlements to formal legal proceedings. The bank had already prepared multiple approaches, all centered on full financial recovery, while giving my family the opportunity to avoid criminal prosecution if they cooperated fully. By the time we finished, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying had lifted. The path forward wasn't simple or painless, but it existed. More importantly, I wasn't facing it alone. Your grandparents were remarkable people, Mr. Daniels said as we concluded. I worked with them personally on establishing these trusts. They loved you very much, and they wanted to protect you, even if that meant protecting you from your own family. I nodded, throat tight with emotion. They always played the long game. Indeed they did, he agreed with a small smile. And they ensured you wouldn't have to face this situation without support. 3 days later, after multiple planning sessions with the legal team, I made a decision. Rather than having attorneys make the initial contact with my family, I would confront them myself, with legal representation present but initially silent. I wanted to see their faces when they realized their careful deception had been documented all along. The bank's attorneys arranged a conference room in a neutral location and sent formal invitations to my parents and Aaron for a family financial discussion that would benefit all parties. Predictably, they accepted immediately, likely assuming this was my attempt at reconciliation. As I prepared for the confrontation, reviewing documents, and practicing what I would say, I felt a strange sense of calm. The devastation of discovery was behind me. The helplessness of the aftermath was fading. Now, finally, I was taking action to restore what had been taken, not just financially but in terms of justice and accountability. The night before the meeting, I slept soundly for the first time in months. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my terms, with truth and evidence on my side. The fine print my grandfather had insisted on, the safeguard my family never knew existed, would finally fulfill its purpose. The law offices of Bergman, Winters and Associates occupied the 27th floor of a downtown high-rise, offering expansive views of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. I arrived 45 minutes early, reviewing strategy once more with Miss Winters and the rest of the legal team. We arranged the conference room carefully. Documents organized in precise stacks. A projector ready to display electronic evidence. Seating positioned so my family would face both me and the city's panorama. Remember, Miss Winters advised, let them talk first. People often reveal more than they intend when they believe they're in control of the narrative. I nodded, checking my watch. The calm I'd felt the previous night had solidified into a steely resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and restoration. At precisely 10 o'clock, the receptionist announced my family's arrival. They entered with the confident expressions of people who believed they were about to manage an uncomfortable but ultimately inconsequential situation. The shock on their faces when they saw the attorneys present was exactly what I had anticipated. Jamal, my father began, recovering quickly. We were under the impression this would be a private family discussion. It is, I replied evenly. These people are here to ensure the discussion is productive. My mother's eyes darted nervously between the attorneys and the documents on the table. Aaron, dressed more conservatively than his recent style, took the seat furthest from me. Before we begin, Dad said, slipping into his authoritative business tone, I want to express how pleased we are that you're ready to move forward. Family disagreements can be painful, but ultimately, blood is thicker than water. I allowed a moment of silence to stretch uncomfortably before responding. This isn't about a disagreement, I said finally. This is about fraud, theft, and betrayal. This is about actions that have legal consequences. Dad's expression hardened. If you've brought lawyers to threaten us, you're wasting everyone's time. As we've explained, the financial decisions regarding the trust were completely legal. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I pressed a button on the remote in front of me, and the projector, illuminated with an image of the special addendum to the trust agreement. "My grandfather didn't trust you," I said simply. "He anticipated that you might try to circumvent his wishes, so he created safeguards you never knew about." The color drained from my mother's face as I continued through a methodical presentation of the evidence. Bank records showing the pattern of withdrawals. Aaron's forged enrollment documents for educational programs he never attended. Email exchanges, where my parents explicitly discussed how to work around trust restrictions. Photos from bank security cameras showing Aaron impersonating me at branches in 3 different states. With each new piece of evidence, their demeanor shifted. Dad's confident posture gradually collapsed. Mom's nervous fidgeting increased to the point where she could barely keep her hands still. Aaron stared at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. As you can see, I concluded after 20 minutes of devastating documentation. This wasn't a reallocation of family resources or a creative interpretation of the trust terms. This was a systematic campaign of fraud. Mr. Silverman, the bank's senior attorney, spoke for the first time. "Fidelity Trust Bank has authorized me to inform you that they intend to pursue full recovery of all misappropriated funds, plus interest and penalties." "You can't prove any of this," Dad blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "We already have," Miss Winters replied calmly. "What you're seeing is approximately 20% of the documentation we've assembled. The bank's internal monitoring systems recorded every transaction, every false statement, every misrepresentation. This is ridiculous." Aaron finally spoke, his tone indignant despite his refusal to make eye contact. "I was just accepting what Mom and Dad said was available to me. I didn't commit fraud." I slid a document across the table to him. "This is an email you sent to the trustees, claiming to be enrolled in a film program at UCLA that doesn't exist. You created a false acceptance letter, false course catalog, and false tuition invoice. You then used the $60,000 for a down payment on your Audi and a vacation to Greece." Aaron's face flushed deep red. I was just doing what Dad told me to." "Aaron," Dad snapped, "don't say another word." The family unity they'd presented at my birthday dinner was fracturing before my eyes. Each was now calculating their individual liability, their personal escape routes. Mom, tears streaming down her face, finally spoke directly to me. "Jamal, sweetheart, we never meant to hurt you. We just wanted to help Aaron get established, and you were always so capable, so independent." Her attempt at emotional manipulation, once so effective, now seemed transparent and pathetic. I didn't respond to the sentiment at all. "The bank is prepared to pursue criminal charges," Mr. Silverman continued. "Banking fraud of this magnitude typically results in significant fines and incarceration." "Incarceration?" Mom whispered, the color draining from her face. "However," I interjected, "I've requested that we first attempt a non-criminal resolution." All 3 of them looked up sharply, hope flickering in their expressions. "These are our terms," I said, sliding folders across the table to each of them. "Full restitution of all misappropriated funds, plus 10% interest. A binding agreement for family therapy with specific behavioral milestones before any contact is resumed. And signed confessions that will be held in escrow and filed only if the financial terms are not met." "This is extortion," Dad sputtered, but without conviction. "No, Mr. Wilson," Miss Winters replied coolly. "This is a remarkably generous alternative to the criminal prosecution the evidence clearly supports. Your son is offering you a path that doesn't involve prison time. We don't have that kind of money available," Dad protested. "The funds have been spent," Dr. Ramirez, who had been silent until now, opened his laptop. Our analysis indicates you have multiple assets that can be liquidated to satisfy the restitution requirement. Your recently renovated home has equity of approximately $600,000. Mr. Aaron Wilson's vehicle, art collection, and luxury goods are conservatively valued at $150,000. Your investment portfolio, funded largely with misappropriated trust money, currently stands at $320,000. The precise accounting of their available assets silenced further protests. I watched as they read through the terms, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. "You'd make us sell our home?" Mom asked, her voice small. "You purchased kitchen appliances with my money," I replied evenly. "You installed a pool with my money. You remodeled your master bathroom with my money. Yes, you'll sell the home, if that's what's required to make restitution." Aaron, looking increasingly panicked, turned to our parents. "You said this was all legal. You promised there couldn't be any blowback." "Be quiet, Aaron," Dad hissed, but the fractures were widening. "No, I'm not going to jail because you two screwed up. I didn't know about any monitoring system or whatever. I just did what you told me to do." The family that had presented such a united front against me was now disintegrating into individual actors, each trying to minimize their own culpability. "The agreement must be signed today," Miss Winters stated firmly, "and the first payment made within 30 days. Otherwise, we proceed with criminal charges." "I need to consult our attorney," Dad insisted. "By all means, call them now," Mr. Silverman replied, sliding a phone toward him. "But understand that the terms are non-negotiable, and the offer expires when you leave this room." What followed was 2 hours of desperate negotiation, not between us and them, but within my family itself. Dad called their attorney, who apparently advised immediate compliance after hearing a summary of the evidence. Mom alternated between tears and attempts to appeal to my emotions. Aaron veered between blaming our parents and trying to minimize his own involvement. Through it all, I remained calm, speaking only when necessary, letting the attorneys handle the details. This wasn't about punishing them, though they clearly deserved punishment. It was about restoring what had been taken and establishing that their actions had consequences. Finally, defeated and subdued, all three of them signed the agreements. My mother, hand trembling, was the last to sign. "I don't understand how it came to this," she said softly. "We're family. We love you." "Love doesn't empty someone's trust fund," I replied. "Love doesn't lie and steal and justify it as helping Aaron. What you call love looks a lot like selfishness from where I'm sitting." With the documents signed and the initial recovery process set in motion, I stood to leave. For a moment, I looked at the 3 people who shared my blood, but had betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way possible. They seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of their actions. "The family therapy requirements are not just a punishment," I said as I gathered my papers. "They're an opportunity, if you choose to take it seriously. I don't know if we can ever repair what you've broken, but that's the only path forward if you want any relationship with me in the future." As I walked out of that conference room, I felt no triumph or vindication. Just a quiet certainty that I had stood up for myself and for the grandparents whose wishes had been so flagrantly disregarded. Whatever happened next would be on my terms, not theirs. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. 6 months after the confrontation, in that sterile conference room, I sat on the balcony of my new condo overlooking Lake Union, watching sailboats catch the late afternoon breeze. The property wasn't as spacious as what I might have purchased with my original trust fund, but it was mine, bought with the first major installment of the restitution payments. The legal process had unfolded much as the attorneys predicted. My parents sold their home, downsizing to a modest townhouse that required no mortgage. Aaron's Audi, designer wardrobe, and various luxury purchases were sold at auction. Dad liquidated investment accounts and retirement funds that weren't protected from civil judgments. The money flowed back in large chunks rather than the steady trickle with which it had been taken. The most surprising development was Aaron's response to the situation. After the initial shock and blame shifting, he had moved out of our parents' home and taken a job as an administrative assistant at a local community college. The position was entry-level, and the pay modest, but it was honest work, perhaps the first he'd ever done. According to the family therapist's reports, he was beginning to acknowledge his role in the fraud, rather than positioning himself as merely following our parents' direction. My parents' journey was more complicated. They attended the required therapy sessions, but initially treated them as a box to check, rather than an opportunity for genuine reflection. Dad especially struggled with admitting the fundamental wrongness of his actions, continuing to frame the theft as unfortunate financial decisions rather than deliberate fraud. Mom vacillated between tearful apologies and subtle attempts to make me feel guilty for the consequences they were facing. Dr. Carter, the family therapist, provided monthly updates as required by our agreement. Her most recent report noted, "The Wilson parents are finally beginning to recognize the magnitude of betrayal. Their actions represented, not just legally, but emotionally. This recognition is uncomfortable for them, but necessary for any authentic reconciliation." My individual therapy with Dr. Marquez continued as well, focusing not just on processing the betrayal, but on rebuilding my sense of security and trust. The work was challenging, but essential. Betrayal by family creates a unique kind of wound, she explained during a recent session. It challenges our most basic assumptions about safety and belonging. Healing requires not just addressing the specific incident, but reconsidering our entire framework for relationships. The financial recovery, while significant, couldn't restore everything that had been lost. My original plan to launch a software development firm had been scaled back to a small consultancy that I operated alongside my full-time job. The timeline for financial independence had stretched from 5 years to perhaps 10. But with each restitution payment, the gap between what should have been and what was narrowed slightly. I had maintained my policy of no direct contact with my family. All communication filtered through attorneys or the therapist. This boundary, initially established from pain and anger, had evolved into a deliberate choice that protected my healing process. Dr. Marquez and I had discussed at length when and how to consider reestablishing direct contact. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the betrayal didn't happen, she had explained. It means freeing yourself from the consuming power of resentment while still holding appropriate boundaries. I wasn't ready for forgiveness yet, but I was approaching a place where I could envision it as a possibility rather than an impossibility. 3 months into the restitution process, I had met Laura at a tech conference where she was presenting on user experience design. Our conversation over coffee had extended to dinner, then to regular dates that evolved naturally into a relationship. She knew my story, had listened with appropriate outrage when I shared it, but never treated me as damaged or defined by that experience. "I like who you are," she told me one evening as we cooked dinner together in my new kitchen. "Not despite what happened with your family, but including how you've handled it. There's strength in standing up for yourself without becoming bitter." Her perspective helped me see that while the betrayal was part of my story, it didn't have to be the defining chapter. The life I was building now, though different from what I'd planned, was still rich with possibility and connection. One unexpected development was my renewed appreciation for my grandparents' wisdom and foresight. The safeguards they had built into the trust reflected not just financial acumen, but a deep understanding of human nature, including the weaknesses of their own child. Their legacy wasn't just monetary. It was a final lesson about preparation, protection, and principled living. The quarterly bank statements now arrived with a sense of restoration rather than loss, each one documenting the gradual recovery of what had been taken. Mr. Daniels occasionally called with updates on particularly large restitution payments or to discuss investment strategies for the recovered funds. His commitment to making things right, though professionally motivated, felt personally meaningful. After 5 months of therapy, Dr. Carter suggested a limited, structured interaction with my parents, a carefully controlled family session designed to test whether meaningful communication was possible. I agreed with trepidation, establishing clear boundaries in advance. The session was awkward but significant. My parents, stripped of their previous affluence and social status, seemed physically smaller, less certain of their place in the world. Dad, once so authoritative, spoke haltingly about his regrettable choices. Mom, makeup minimal and jewelry absent, listened more than she spoke, a new behavior for her. I don't expect you to forgive us, Dad said toward the end of the session, the first truly honest statement I'd heard from him since the discovery. But I hope eventually you can believe that we regret what we did, not just the consequences, but the actions themselves. It wasn't a magical reconciliation, but it was a small step toward whatever new reality might eventually emerge from the ashes of our former relationship. Aaron's participation in family therapy was inconsistent, his journey more turbulent than our parents'. Sometimes he seemed genuinely remorseful. Other sessions found him resentful and defensive. His text message on my birthday, the first direct communication I'd accepted from any of them, revealed the complexity of his process. I'm sorry, not just for the money, but for being the favorite at your expense for so long. I never questioned it because it benefited me. Working on being better. Simple words, imperfect, but honest. I didn't respond immediately, letting the message sit while I processed my feelings about this tentative bridge between us. The true measure of healing, I was learning, wasn't the absence of pain when thinking about what happened, but the diminishing power that pain held over my present and future. The trust fund betrayal would always be part of my history, but increasingly, it was a chapter rather than the whole story. As I sat on my balcony that evening, watching the sunset paint the water with gold and coral, I reflected on what my grandfather had once told me during one of our fishing trips. The most valuable things in life can't be stolen, Jamal. Your integrity, your courage, your capacity for growth, those belong only to you. He had been right, though perhaps not in the way he'd imagined when sharing that wisdom with a teenage boy. The betrayal had taken money and security, but it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Resilience, boundaries, the courage to stand alone when necessary. The future remained uncertain in many ways. The relationship with my family would never return to what it had been, though whether that was entirely negative was debatable, given the dysfunction that had always existed beneath the surface. My financial path had been altered, but not destroyed. And most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment, to verify rather than assume, to read the fine print in both legal documents and relationships. I picked up my phone, and after a moment's consideration, typed a brief response to Aaron's text from weeks earlier. Thank you for the apology. I'm not ready for more contact yet, but I appreciate the honesty. Keep doing the work. Small steps, careful boundaries. A life rebuilt, not according to the original blueprint, but designed with hard-won wisdom. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it was a path forward, and ultimately, that's what mattered most. What did you think of this story? Have you ever discovered fine print that saved you from a difficult situation? Drop a comment below with your experience. Hit that like button if you've ever had to stand up to family members who crossed boundaries. And subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share this with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, sometimes the most important details are in the smallest print.